Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, we're going to be talking yet again about artificial intelligence, or AI. This time, we're going to be applying it to psychological testing. So this is going to probably be in a series of how's AI going to help the field? I think psychological testing is a unique one I want to focus on just because there's a few layers to it. And so I'll talk a little bit about, I think, how AI is going to augment. Talk about probably two primary dangers associated with it, and the way that we might be able to preserve the field of psychological testing. Now, a quick caveat, I'm going to be focused mostly on what's called, or I call, kind of traditional psychological testing. These are generally people who are referred not for neurodevelopmental concerns like ADHD, autism spectrum, and not necessarily for neuropsychological concerns. This is post-TBI or concerns of dementia, et cetera, et cetera. So this traditional psychological testing is going to be the focus. Will some of this apply to neurodevelopmental testing and as well as neuropsychological testing? Oh, you better believe it. And I think they need to think too about how AI might augment and or the scary one, replace some of what they do, because I think they are on a similar trajectory. So again, traditional psychological testing. So in what ways could AI augment? Well, I think I've mentioned, at least in another AI episode, the importance of it augmenting administrative tasks. Administrative tasks are not terribly on the top of most people's to-do lists, including those of us who do psychological testing. Now, a quick caveat here is, I think, in the interpretation or creating conclusions that are nuanced to the individual, I think AI is going to have a harder time. But we're talking about like collating someone's psychosocial history, especially if it's transcribing while we interview, as well as collating potential recommendations and those sorts of things. That is right up AI's alley, and I think will be very beneficial for us. But again, the nuanced interpretations, I think it could struggle a little bit more with, or it'll give us some examples, but it's not necessarily going to give us all the answers and how we would want to personally write it. Now, I will say this assumes that the provider is interested in providing a nuanced interpretation, which is getting to a later point that I think there's many providers that it's basically just like, list and, you give a diagnosis and anything written thereafter, you could just strip right out of WebMD. I always tell my psychological interns, my doctoral level psych interns, like, why would we be writing a report that's tailored to the individual that could easily be Googled? Like, there needs to be something unique to what we're providing. And in my opinion, this conclusions section where we're hypothesizing and helping people conceptualize is really where we need to spend most of our mental efforts. It's probably the most unique part of a report, and thereby harder to augment or be replaced by AI. Number two is, speaking of interpretations and conceptualization, when we administer tests, these tests spit out what are called interpretive reports. Now, not everybody pays for these, and not all tests have them, but they do exist, and I think with AI, increasingly they will exist more and more, and they'll be more complicated in how they analyze the data that are fed to them. And once again, this is right up AI's alley. When it has a ton of data points and it compares those data points to a normative sample. A normative sample is what we call a sample people who we give these tests, and we compare our clients to those sets of data. They can be really broad from an overall population to more narrow, such as a specific population like a community mental health population or an inpatient, people who have been previously hospitalized population. I mean, that's its jam. AI is very easily capable of doing this. And the interpretive reports it'll spit out, I think, can become increasingly complex and increasingly individualized for the person who is engaging in the testing. And that's a good thing. I mean, it's doing analysis that we simply cannot do as mere human beings. It would take me hours and hours to scour data and research out there. Emphasis on data and research and not what Wikipedia or something else says, but it would take me a long time to do that type of analysis, and my goodness, it would be very helpful for AI to augment that or even replace it. A little sidebar is us providers should read that stuff and learn from it and not just like assume like AI is always going to take care of business. I mean, we should add to our knowledge in the field in the process. And so once again, it's going to augment the field. Now, I think those are test administration. I think AI is going to probably come into the fray as well. There's quite a few tests that can be pretty easily administered through computer-based means, including, a little bit of the transaction of taking the test itself. I think it's going to have a hard time fully replacing human beings because one of the big latent variables to testing, particularly when we talk about like cognitive testing, these are tests that are more taxing, more puzzle-based, is keeping a relationship going and keeping morale up is no small thing in psychological testing. I mean, there's a huge variable there. If you just like have a computer take over and just be like, do this, do this, do this, do you need a break, right? It's obviously AI is getting better. It's not going to talk to you like a old school 1960s robot or something, but that interpersonal piece should not be underestimated. I can't tell you how many times I tested people in adulthood and they do substantially better when they were younger, which is not typically how that's going to work. And my guess often is that the examiner early on did not have sufficient rapport, or something was going on that was causing the patient as a child to disengage. I would argue the same is true even if you were to test it 2 separate times in adulthood. So the administration piece, again, I think generally it's going to augment. However, I think there's still danger in replacing us professionals. I really do. And there's a few reasons for that. One is what the sort of perception about AI, I think, is very important. Already we project a lot of competence onto AI, competence that is not necessarily earned yet. I mean, it's not in its infancy. AI has been around for a long time, but we're talking this kind of more impressive version of AI is a little bit newer. But even still, we project a ton of competence onto it. Even I find myself doing this. It spits something out. I'm like, oh, wow, maybe that's something I don't know. Then I'd have to spend the time, which us providers already don't have in a very busy, capitalistic, managed care world, to then go research and cross-check and cross-reference that. So when you have a lack of time due to high volume, high demand, all this kind of stuff, on top of projected confidence onto AI, it's very plausible that providers will default to much of what the AI is telling them, and they will not necessarily push against it. Why is that dangerous? Well, why would you need an expert if that's going to be what starts to happen? Sure, you want an expert to cross-reference and double-check these things, much like, you probably want somebody spot-checking an MRI AI reads in the future of, if there's any condition. Well, get a second set of eyes, human-based. But is that going to really pay terribly well? Are people really going to enjoy that job? Like high-quality, deep thinkers, critical thinkers going to enjoy just a spot-check job? I don't think so. And so I think that's where the encroachment is going to happen. It's not necessarily that it intrinsically or naturally will 100% replace expertise. It is how it is wielded will begin to push expertise out. And how people encounter it will push expertise out. And that is a serious threat. Number 2 is an interesting kind of parallels with something else happening in the field. Now, I'm going to be careful about this because it can get dicey for a lot of folks. And that's the inclusion of more master-level providers in the psychological testing process. Now, there's already several states, and in fact, numerous countries that allow individuals without doctorates to do psychological testing. This is its own debate. There's pros and cons to this. Accessibility is a wonderful pro to this because demand is so high and the supply for testing is quite low. And, there's plenty of talented master-level providers, especially using the guidance of, doctorate-level providers, that they could be very competent doing this. You look at the world of psychiatry right now. The demand for psychiatry is so high, we have tons of psychiatric nurse prescribers now who get a lot of training through psychiatry. And you have this sort of counterbalancing force where I hear plenty of complaints about those psychiatric nurse prescribers as being not, terribly up to snuff, or I feel like, they feel like they don't have competence or confidence in their competence. But then I also hear a lot of wonderful reviews of these providers just as well. And I would bargain the same is going to happen with psychological testing. There's going to be many out there that really just don't have the training or acumen or care to really specialize in psych testing, and you'll get an inferior product at the end of the day. But there will also be many talented ones kicking butt and taking names. Now, why does this matter? Let's get back to AI. Well, what does capitalism do? In a situation where you have various providers at various educational levels, some that are paid higher and some that are paid lower, and then you have an argument that AI is doing anywhere from 50% to 51% plus, or 60 or 75% of the work, especially if providers project that competence onto AI and tend not to challenge it. What do you think capitalism is going to do with that? I'll answer that for you. They're going to pay the least amount of money possible and let AI do more of the work. And you will get an inferior product. Independent of provider talent, you will get an inferior product. Is it better than the current product? I would bargain maybe in a lot of cases it could be, because again, AI is going to augment in really helpful ways. But once again, how it's wielded and what we end up doing is the greater challenge. And so you will have the influx of the AI component. What's the opposite of influx? Downflux? But you'll have less expertise wielding and wielding the AI and interacting with the AI testing. That's, I know, not a terribly optimistic prediction, but no, it's just a prediction. But I think it's a realistic one. It's just how the world currently works. The only way I think we will prevent that from happening is if consumers start to get wise on what's already been happening in the world, where there is this deterioration of quality of the services offered, both medical field and mental health field. And that's not necessarily because of providers. It's because of the system around which providers have to exist. It is a very shaky system at present and does not lend itself to nuance, to individualized care and a lot of focused attention. It just does not. And so if consumers get wise to this and push back, that could actually be one of the most important safeguards against this alleged prediction that I have. We shall see. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I'd offer, okay, is there a way that we can retain or save this? And my answer is, yeah, I think there is. And so what I would do is I would divide traditional psychological testing into two domains. One is a more transactional domain. The other is a kind of a more abstract, patient-centered domain or method. The transactional version, I think, is what a lot of people are familiar with, and people who, I think people are inadvertently trained in as well. Not everybody, but quite a few. And that's basically saying, like, look, I want to know what diagnosis this person has, run some tests and tell me what the diagnosis is. And, you'll input the data and, you'll look at the things and then you'll provide a diagnosis and then you just give a bunch of recommendations based on whatever that diagnosis is. And it's not terribly individualized. Sure, there's some thought about unique independent variables, but let's fit them into this box. Well, if you take that more transactional approach, so you're not really applying deep critical thought or the sort of applying the inherent gray that exists in testing. Anybody who tells you that testing is a more black and white and firm black and white way of assessing people, I think they are misguided and they put far too much trust in psychological testing. But this more transactional approach, I think, will very easily be taken over by AI and have lesser paid individuals that are steering the AI in the process. How long? 10, 20, 30 years? I don't know, but I think that type of testing is going to go away. If you are a psychologist, especially listening to this, you might want to shift up your methods sooner than later, if that is your current methodology or your current conceptualization of what constitutes psychological testing. That is at risk. It's at risk independent of AI. It's going to be assuredly at risk with the influx of AI. So what's this more abstract, kind of patient-forward version? The term currently used, I think, best describes this type of testing as therapeutic assessment. This is an approach of increasing popularity. I've got a video, it's on my website too, explaining kind of my version of therapeutic assessment. And it really takes data and thinks of it as like it's extra data that provides incremental validity to interpretive hypotheses and recommendations for a client. It is not the law, and we're not focused solely on diagnoses. We're focused on client questions and curiosities. It's very insight-driven. It's very Q&A. It's a very friendly game of tennis, and that is not something that AI is easily going to get into. Will it still augment through writing and data analysis, all that stuff? Of course it will. Of course it will. when it comes to interacting sequentially over time and treating data points as gray zones that you can kind of collaborate and talk around with the patient, AI is not going to replace that anytime soon. And if you like the sound of this approach, which I encourage you to look up if you've never heard of it before, and you really love testing, I would strongly encourage you to start looking into this, to see if this is something that you could really enjoy and lean into and begin to offer. And that's not important just for AI purposes, just even for insurance reimbursement. Therapeutic assessment is kind of this new agey thing that a lot of providers even in the field are unaware of, and thereby it doesn't get as much support, and thereby it becomes this more like nuanced side thing that you offer people rather than something understood by and unequivocally covered by private insurance or Medicaid, Medicare, whatever it is that you might have here in the States. So that's my hopefully somewhat more optimistic side of this episode, is like, hey, therapeutic assessment though is right there waiting for you, and it's going to be more resistant to being taken over by AI if you're concerned about being taken over by AI. But again, at the end of the day, we don't know. We don't know how much it's going to augment versus encroach. I think personally, it's good to get ahead of this and start thinking ahead, even if it doesn't encroach as much as we might be afraid it might. But I think it's good to get ahead and start carving out areas of specialty now. That I think it's just a smart thing to do, and I think an economical thing to do. And it's a product that a lot of patients really enjoy. I mean, if they want the quick and dirty answer, we can come up with quicker and dirtier ways to provide those answers. We don't need specialty for that necessarily. But when people need specialty, they need specialty. And we need more people who provide that more specialized care. They'll ideally only be augmented and not replaced by AI. So those are my thoughts on psych testing and its intersections with AI. As ever, I hope that is interesting and thought-provoking. And I hope it's been, I'm just saying the same thing twice. So I'll just do my typical ending. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and stay curious.